announcement of the Japanese surrender. This dramatic event has been recorded by radio correspondents, and it comes to us now by shortwave from the Pacific.
Attention, the peoples of the world. World War II is about to come to its official closing. We're on the Pacific Fleet flagship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay for the signing of the surrender of Japan. 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days since the attack on Pearl Harbor. We are 3,700 miles from there, but we have come much further than that by way of the Central Pacific, New Guinea, the Marianas, and the Philippines. The Japanese delegation has just arrived. Military men in formal military uniform and dignitaries, civilian dignitaries in formal attire. Lined up before us are more officers and men with high-ranking stars and gold braid than has been assembled in this bay for many a long time. The deck of the Missouri stretches out before us. We're on the veranda deck. Its great guns are pointed skyward to allow more room for the Army, Navy, Marines, and the representatives of the nations who are here. Planes have been flying overhead. The day is quite cloudy, a mist surrounding the mountains that come down to form Tokyo Bay. Before us here are flags. Oh, here comes the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur. With him, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and other dignitaries.
General MacArthur is now facing the microphones. He is about to start his speech, which explains the signing surrender and also calls.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Concluding the brief history-making ceremony, General MacArthur expresses a wish.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
At 9:23 a.m. on Sunday, September 2nd, 1945, World War II officially came to a peaceful end within the 23-minute ceremony. Since the surprise Japanese offensives on American Army and naval bases throughout the Pacific on December 7th and 8th, 1941, the United States had been at war with the Empire of Japan for 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days. On this day, though, the overwhelming pre-war senses of despair of the Great Depression and anxiety of the Second World War both yielded to a national feeling of exhilaration for absolute victory following the surrender of Japan earlier on August 14th. For the United States, the conclusion of the Second World War came with a substantial cost. defense spending peaked at 37.5% of the U.S. GDP in 1945. In total, the financial cost of the war effort to manufacture the weapons of war itself was $334 billion. Around 12,209,000 Americans served in the American Armed Forces. In order to arm American servicemen in the Pacific and Europe, approximately 12.5 million military small arms were turned out by both government arsenals and commercial companies within a decade. Such an armament provided a valuable use for the military not only during the war but afterwards as well. Prior to American involvement in World War II, the U.S. government recognized the need for the production of more small arms for service since war was inevitable and there would have been a serious shortage for the ever-growing armed forces. American companies worked around the clock during the war in order to arm the nation's servicemen. September 2, 1945 not only saw the conclusion of the war, but lucrative contracts to manufacture military arms, which abruptly ended within a matter of months. To the extent of the Ordnance Department's perception, government arsenals had enough weapons to arm servicemen going forward in a post-World War II era. For the next 5 years, the Ordnance Department promptly shifted from the procurement of newly manufactured service rifles to refurbishing the arms it held in its arsenals with both surplus armory manufactured components and serviceable parts which were salvaged from World War II manufactured rifles. Springfield Armory continued to manufacture M1 rifle parts excluding receivers. By 1950, Springfield Armory and Winchester spare receivers were just about exhausted, incorporated into approximately 500,000 new M1 rifles made up of mismatched, interchangeable components. As with the Lend-Lease Act to aid America's allies with arms to defeat fascism, American foreign policy to aid its allies facing hostile incursions did not change much following the war. Following the war, the Soviets did not make it a secret that the state planned the exportation of Bolshevik revolutionary ideology past the controlled territories which lined its borders. In order to assure the success of the policy of containment, American weaponry, including the battle-proven M1, were loaned out to armories and insurgent forces battling communist expansion within regions of the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. As in Europe, the further encroachment of the evil ideology into Asia alarmed the free world. Supplied with captured Japanese arms by Russian forces in Manchuria, Mao Zedong's battle-hardened communist forces overthrew the Republic of China in January of 1950. Russian occupation remained north of the 30th parallel of Korea following World War II. Colonial oppressed nations in Asia too were targets of Stalin's communist ambitions. Though the offensive technique of containment had deterred the western spread of communism throughout the rest of Europe, the framework of American foreign policy changed into a defensive mentality to block international Soviet efforts moving forward. In 1950, it was thought that Korea was the last place where assertive foreign policy would be implemented by the government to contain communism. Since the conclusion of World War II, two internal factions were scrambling to seize power of the entire peninsula. On Saturday, June 24, 1950, in a full-scale invasion, the North Korean People's Army invaded the South, crossing the 30th parallel. The incursion of 75,000 troops surprised the South Republic of Korea Army and the few U.S. bases, as the communist forces moved to Seoul to capture first, in order to liberate the people, and then move on further south to the port city of Pusan. Without hesitation, President Harry Truman responded with American forces, followed by UN allies, in an attempt to deter further communist aggression on the Korean peninsula. Initially, the Allies hoped that their reaction would not provoke a larger war with the Soviet Union and China. Though Stalin had operated primarily defensively to counter threats of the NATO alliance, he was not willing to push the state's actions far enough to risk war. China cautioned that it would not tolerate an American presence along the border. The Cold War turned hot in June of 1950, as America found itself and a foreign undeclared proxy war. The fighting in Korea will be declared a police action by the Truman administration, to be supervised by the UN and commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. As the Soviets would supply arms to revolutionaries under its sphere of influence, the American military and 12 UN allies were called to arms to push back the communist incursion. As the primary standard issue service rifle for the American Armed Forces, the United States Rifle, Caliber 30 M1, returned to the battlefield to fight yet another evil ideology of despotism. The outbreak of war renewed demand for American weaponry. More rebuilt M1 rifles began to fill arsenal racks. Though there were quite a few overhauled by Springfield Armory prior to June 1950, the scale of the international police action in Korea depleted American arsenals. In order to address the demand, Springfield Armory was ordered to resume its production of the M1 rifle in early 1951. Throughout the Second World War, production of the rifle had been smoothed out as mass quantities of the weapon left the government armory to arsenals to equip servicemen of the Pacific and European theaters of war. However, new manufacturing of the rifle had been suspended for almost 6 years, and to simply jump back into the mass production of the weapon was not a reality. New production M1 rifles started in the initial serial number range assigned by the Ordnance Department at 4.2 million. Springfield Armory did not make its first initial delivery of the newly manufactured M1 rifle until early 1952. The basic design did not change from the plans of World War II. Other than replacing the rear sight assembly and the addition of a relief cut for the operating rod, the M1 rifle was mechanically and by sight identical to those produced up to 1945. Initial production met other delays during the first year of remanufacturing the post-war M1 rifle. Metallurgy problems caused 120,000 barrel blanks manufactured by Springfield Armory to be rejected. The Marlin Firearms Company, in response, received a short-term government contract to make barrels for the M1 rifle until the production problem was rectified by the government armory. Production of the M1 rifle by Springfield Armory during the Korean War paled in contrast to the quantities the Armory produced during World War II. From 1952 to May 7, 1957, almost 4 years after the war, the government arsenal only manufactured 637,420 M1 rifles. In total, Springfield Armory produced from 1937 to 1957 4,188,669 M1 rifles. As in World War II, Springfield Armory was not the sole manufacturer of the M1 rifle. The International Harvester Corporation of Evansville, Indiana, was contracted by the government to build the post-war M1 rifles. By the end of the fiscal year of 1953, it had produced and delivered 6,804 rifles. The Harrington and Richardson Arms Company of Worcester, Massachusetts, was the second prime contractor, producing approximately 140,000 M1 rifles by the end of 1954. For the war effort, the Ordnance Department assigned production of the rifle up to serial number block range of 6 million. Though serial number blocks were assigned, production of the M1 rifle was not consecutive, due to the rifle's production being assigned to 3 contractors. Even though the IHC and HRA companies faced production issues, these rifles were just as serviceable as the rifles produced by Springfield Armory. By early 1953, production of the M1 rifle quickly outpaced the demand of the weapon for Allied forces on the Korean Peninsula. Most firearm historians doubt if the rifles made by IHC and HRA made it to American overseas operations in Korea, remaining stateside for training of new recruits and being loaned out to UN allies. Like the M1 rifles manufactured during World War II, the Korean War rifles were stamped underneath the stock of the pistol grip with a Circle P upon passing the high-pressure cartridge firing test. On the left side of the stock, after a serial number range of 4.3 million, was stamped SAJLG. SA representing Springfield Armory and the initials JLG for Colonel James A. Guyon. The Armory stamp was later replaced by the Department of Defense acceptance stamps following Colonel Guyon's retirement. M1 rifles made by IHC and HRA were also stamped with the DoD cartouche. Dubbed the greatest battle implement ever devised by General George S. Patton, the M1 rifle gained an invaluable admiration among servicemen who carried the standard issue service weapon into battle. Though more semi-automatic and select firearms were sporadically issued to both sides during the Korean War, the M1 rifle remained the only military semi-automatic arm that was standard issue during the first half of the 1950s. In order to equip servicemen at home and abroad, approximately 1.5 million new M1 rifles were manufactured between 1952 and 1957. In the hands of ground troops for 2 years, 1 month, and 2 days, the Korean War M1 rifle proved once again as an indispensable battle rifle. With such high regards, the weapon did suffer from its initial design 3 limitations which became more evident during the Korean War. The rifle weighed over 10 pounds when loaded. It did not have a higher magazine capacity, and the M1 rifle was not capable for selective fire. Before the end of World War II, Springfield Armory engineers worked addressing these issues, developing several prototypes which were nearly identical to the M1 rifle for the Ordnance Department consideration. The rifle in the works not only had to replace the M1 rifle, but other selective fire issued weapons American troops carried into battle. In service for over 21 years, with 5,468,772 produced, the M1 rifle became officially obsolete on May 1, 1957, as the Ordnance Department, in accordance to NATO standardized small arms caliber requirements, adopted the U.S. rifle caliber 7.62mm M14 rifle. Though the M14 became standard issue of American forces going forward up into the early 1960s, the obsolete M1 rifle and its M1C and M1D configurations continued to serve American forces in limited roles well into the 1970s.